Imagine waking up one morning. Your father is alive. Your mother is alive. Your children are sleeping in the next room. By nightfall, they're all dead. And it isn't just your family. It's your neighbor. It's the priest. It's the doctor who came to help. It's your entire street. Your entire city. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for millions of people across Europe and Asia in the 14th century. This is the story of the Black Death, the single deadliest disaster in human history, and what it did to our world. Introduction. Welcome back. Today, we're going somewhere dark, deep into the 14th century, to tell the story of a catastrophe that most people don't fully understand. The Black Death is often mentioned in history classes as a footnote, a plague that killed a lot of people in the Middle Ages. But the real story is so much bigger than that. Between 1347 and 1351, in just 4 years, the Black Death killed an estimated 50 million people. That's somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population. Gone in 4 years. To put that in modern terms, imagine if a disease today killed every single person in the United States and Canada combined. That's the scale of what we're talking about. And what makes it even more remarkable is what came after, because the Black Death didn't just kill people. It completely transformed human civilization. Where did I come from? So where did this nightmare begin? The origin traces back to Central Asia, likely somewhere in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan in the 1330s. The culprit was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which lived in the bloodstream of rodents, particularly rats and ground squirrels. The bacteria spread through fleas. The fleas fed on infected rodents, picked up the bacteria, and when those rodents died, the fleas looked for a new host and found humans. From Central Asia, the plague traveled along the Silk Road, the ancient trade network connecting Asia to Europe. It moved through merchant caravans, through army camps, through the arteries of medieval commerce. By 1347, it had reached the Black Sea, and then in October of that year, a Genoese trading ship docked in the port of Messina, Sicily. Most of the sailors on board were dead. Those still alive were covered in black, oozing sores. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. The symptoms, the disease that these sailors carried, moved with terrifying speed. The first symptoms were flu-like: fever, chills, extreme fatigue. Normal enough, easy to dismiss. But within days came the defining horror of the Black Death: the buboes. Lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin would swell to the size of an egg, sometimes as large as an apple. These swellings were called buboes, which is where the term bubonic plague comes from. Then the bleeding started. Internal bleeding caused dark, almost black blotches to appear under the skin, giving the disease its name, the Black Death. In most cases, death followed within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. And here's the most terrifying part. Medieval doctors had absolutely no idea what was causing it, how it spread, or how to stop it. Their treatments included bloodletting, applying live chickens to the swellings, and burning aromatic herbs. None of it worked. Many of the doctors who tried to help simply caught the disease themselves and died. The scale of devastation. Now let's talk about what this actually looked like on the ground, because the numbers alone don't capture the reality. In Florence, Italy, one of the wealthiest and most cultured cities in the world at that time, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched the catastrophe unfold firsthand. He described neighbors dying alone in their homes with no one to bury them, bodies piling up in the streets, gravediggers running out of room in cemeteries. The Pope in Avignon, France, Clement VI, faced the same problem. The city's cemeteries were full, so he consecrated the Rhine River itself, declaring it holy. Ground so that bodies could be thrown into it. In England, entire villages were wiped out. You can still visit parts of the English countryside today and see deserted medieval villages, grassy fields with subtle earthwork patterns that mark where streets and homes once stood, before the Black Death emptied them forever. In some parts of the Middle East, the death toll was just as catastrophic. And across Europe, a kind of collective psychological breakdown took hold. People believed this was God's punishment. Some turned to extreme acts of self-flagellation, literally whipping themselves in public processions as an act of penance. Others turned violent. Rumors spread that Jewish communities had poisoned the water supply. Across Germany and beyond, Jewish communities were massacred in waves of paranoid violence, one of history's most tragic examples of scapegoating during a crisis. Fear and grief had turned entire populations against each other. How the Black Death changed everything. But here is where the Black Death story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because this catastrophe, as devastating as it was, fundamentally reshaped human civilization in ways that are still shaping our world today. The first transformation was economic. Before the Black Death, feudal lords controlled peasant farmers completely. Workers had no power, no rights, and no alternatives. The plague changed that overnight. With half the workforce dead, the surviving workers suddenly had leverage they had never had before. Landowners competed for laborers. Wages rose. Serfs demanded and won freedoms their parents could never have imagined. Many historians argue that the Black Death did more to end feudalism in Europe than any political movement ever could. The second transformation was the relationship between religion and science. When the plague struck, the church told people it was God's punishment and that prayer was the answer. But people prayed, and they died anyway. The church's authority, its claim to have answers, took a massive hit from which it never fully recovered. Many historians trace the seeds of the Protestant Reformation directly back to the Black Death and the crisis of faith it created. And in its place, something new began to grow. The idea that humans needed to actually understand disease through observation, through evidence, through science. The third transformation, and perhaps the most enduring, was the birth of public health. Venice, in 1377, created the world's first formal quarantine system. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions had to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could come ashore. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. That system, born out of desperation in the 14th century, is the direct ancestor of the quarantine protocols we used during COVID-19. What did humanity learn? So what did humanity ultimately take from the Black Death? First, that disease does not care about your social status, your wealth, your faith, or your power. It killed kings and peasants alike. That universal vulnerability changed how societies thought about collective responsibility. Second, that human knowledge has limits, and those limits are dangerous. The medieval world had no framework for understanding germ theory. The Black Death was the brutal teacher that pushed medicine slowly, painfully, toward the scientific method. Third, that our interconnectedness is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. The same trade routes that brought wealth and culture to medieval Europe also brought the plague. The same lesson applies today in the age of global air travel and supply chains. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, that human civilization is resilient in ways that are almost impossible to comprehend. A civilization that lost half its population in 4 years, that watched its cities empty, its farms fall fallow, its institutions collapse, and yet, within a century, Europe entered the Renaissance, one of the greatest explosions of art, science, and human achievement in all of history. From the ashes of the Black Death, something extraordinary was born. Conclusion: the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. It is, by any measure, the deadliest catastrophe in human history. But it is also the story of how humanity, at its lowest, most desperate point, found the seeds of its greatest transformation. Next time you hear about quarantine protocols, workers' rights, the scientific revolution, or the Renaissance, know that all of it has roots in that terrible darkness of the 14th century. The Black Death didn't just take lives. It remade the world. What do you think is the most important lesson from the Black Death? Let me know in the comments. If this video gave you a new perspective on history, I'd really appreciate a like. It makes a huge difference for this channel. Subscribe so you catch our next video, where we're covering the rise and fall of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. Until then, see you in the next one.